What if Paul's letters were not just teachings, but a psychological map of human struggle, leadership pressure, and inner transformation? Because when you read them in order, something unexpected happens. They stop looking like isolated messages and start revealing a pattern, a progression, almost like you're watching a mind evolve under pressure, and it begins with a tone that many overlook. The earliest letters don't sound like a distant authority. They sound urgent, raw, almost protective. In 1 Thessalonians, you don't see a rigid teacher. You see someone deeply concerned about stability, about people losing direction too quickly. There's reassurance, repetition, a constant return to hope. Why? Because psychologically, Paul is dealing with a group that is fragile, new believers, easily shaken, and he knows it. So instead of overwhelming them with complexity, he reinforces identity over and over again, almost like someone trying to anchor a mind that is drifting. But then something shifts. In 2 Thessalonians, the tone tightens. The same group, but now confusion has entered, false ideas, distorted expectations, and Paul doesn't just comfort anymore, he corrects. Firmly. You can feel the change. The patience is still there, but now there's urgency mixed with authority. Because psychologically, when confusion grows, clarity must become sharper. And this is where the pattern begins to reveal itself. Paul is not just writing theology, he's responding to mental states, fear, instability, misinterpretation, and adjusting his voice accordingly, which raises a question most people never ask. Are these letters teaching doctrine, or are they showing how to lead people through different psychological stages of faith? Now, something unexpected happens. The tone becomes more intense, more confrontational, almost uncomfortable, because in Galatians, Paul is no longer reassuring, he's challenging directly. And that shift reveals something deeper than theology. It reveals frustration, not random frustration, but targeted, controlled. Because the issue here is not ignorance, it's distortion after understanding. These are people who already knew the foundation, but allowed it to be altered. And psychologically, that's a different problem. It's not about teaching, it's about correction under resistance. You can feel it in the language. There's less softness, more urgency, more direct confrontation, almost like someone trying to snap another person out of a dangerous mindset. And that tells you something about Paul's leadership. He doesn't treat all situations the same. He adjusts intensity based on what the mind in front of him needs. But then, another shift. In 1 Corinthians, the challenge becomes more complex. Because now it's not one issue, it's many. Division, ego, immaturity, misuse of freedom. And Paul doesn't just correct, he dissects behavior, he breaks down patterns, why people act the way they act, why they compete, why they distort what was meant to build them. It's almost like psychological analysis disguised as instruction. And then in 2 Corinthians, everything changes again. The tone softens, but not in weakness, in vulnerability. Suddenly, Paul is not just correcting others, he's revealing himself. His struggles, his pressure, his emotional weight. And this is where something powerful happens, because instead of leading only from authority, he leads from exposure, and that creates connection on a different level, which raises another question. Is true leadership about being right, or about being real enough for others to recognize themselves in you? Then something shifts again, but this time it's quieter, more structured, almost strategic. Because in Romans, Paul is no longer reacting to chaos, he's building a framework. And that changes everything. The tone is different, less emotional, more precise, less reactive, more intentional. It feels like he's stepping back and organizing everything he has learned into a system that can hold under pressure. And psychologically, that reveals something critical. When instability is high, you respond. But when clarity is needed long-term, you construct. Romans is not just a letter, it's architecture. A way to stabilize thinking, to remove confusion before it even begins. Every idea builds on the previous one. Every argument closes a gap that could later become doubt. It's almost like Paul is thinking ahead, anticipating where the mind might break, and reinforcing it before it does. But here's what most people miss. This level of structure doesn't come from distance. It comes from experience. He's not writing theory. He's writing after seeing what happens when people misunderstand, distort, or lose direction, and that changes how you read it. because now every line feels less like information and more like protection. Protection against confusion, against imbalance, against a faith that collapses under pressure. And then you realize something deeper. Paul is no longer just guiding people, he's shaping how they think, which raises a powerful question. What if the strongest faith isn't the most emotional, but the most structurally grounded? But structure alone doesn't solve everything, because people are not systems. And this is where the next letters reveal something even more subtle. In Ephesians, the tone shifts into identity, not correction, not confrontation, identity. Paul begins to speak in a way that builds internal alignment, who you are, what you represent, how you see yourself within something bigger. And psychologically, this is a different level of development, because once confusion is removed, the next step is reinforcement. You don't just need clarity, you need a stable sense of self, and that's exactly what he builds, layer by layer. But then comes Philippians, and something unexpected happens again. The tone becomes lighter, almost joyful, but not superficial joy, controlled joy, intentional joy. And that reveals something deeper, because this is not written from comfort. It's written from limitation, pressure, restriction, and yet the message is not frustration, it's perspective, which means this isn't natural emotion, it's trained response, a disciplined mindset that refuses to collapse under external pressure. And that changes everything, because now Paul is not just teaching others how to think, he's demonstrating it under real conditions. And that creates a different kind of authority, not one based on position, but on proof. And that leads to a deeper realization. Mindset is not revealed when things are easy. It's exposed when everything is constrained. Which raises a question that goes beyond theology. Are you reacting to your environment, or have you trained your mind to lead it? Then the tone sharpens again, but in a very specific way, because in Colossians, Paul is not just building identity, he's protecting it from distortion. And this reveals a new psychological layer, influence, not external pressure, but subtle ideas that slowly reshape belief from the inside. You can feel the precision in his language. He's not reacting emotionally. He's cutting through confusion with clarity, almost like someone identifying a pattern before it spreads, because the issue here is not obvious error, it's mixture, truth blended with ideas that seem harmless, but shift focus over time. And that's what makes it dangerous. Psychologically, mixture is harder to detect than opposition, because it doesn't feel wrong. It feels slightly off, and most people don't notice the difference until their thinking is already affected. Paul does, and that's why his tone is so controlled. Every statement redirects attention, every line recenters identity. He's not just correcting belief, he's restoring focus. And then something interesting happens in Philemon. The scale becomes smaller, but the depth increases. This is no longer about groups. It's about a single relationship, a personal conflict. And suddenly, Paul's approach changes again. No commands, no authority pressure, just influence through perspective. He reframes the situation, he shifts how one person sees another, and that reveals something powerful. Real transformation doesn't always come from force. It comes from how you reshape perception, because when perception changes, behavior follows. And that exposes a deeper truth. The strongest influence is not control. It's the ability to change how someone sees what's right in front of them. Now everything becomes more personal, more intentional, more focused on development, because in 1 Timothy, Paul is no longer addressing crowds, he's shaping a leader, and that changes the entire dynamic. The tone is direct, structured, almost like a blueprint, but not for belief and for responsibility, because psychologically, leading others requires something different than following. It requires discipline when no one is watching, clarity when others are confused, stability when pressure increases. And Paul knows that, so he doesn't just give instructions, he defines standards, what to avoid, what to pursue, what to guard internally. And that reveals something critical. Leadership is not about position, it's about internal order. And then in 2 Timothy, everything intensifies, because now there's urgency, not panic, but awareness of time. You can feel it in the tone. It's more emotional, but also more focused, almost like someone passing something forward before it's too late. And that changes the weight of every word, because now it's not just guidance, it's legacy. Paul is no longer just teaching. He's transferring mindset, endurance, focus, the ability to stay aligned even when everything around you shifts. And that reveals a deeper psychological truth. The final stage of growth is not learning more. It's becoming stable enough to carry what you've learned without losing it under pressure. And that leads to a question that most people avoid. Are you still dependent on external direction? Or have you developed the internal strength to stay aligned on your own? At this point, something deeper begins to surface. Something that goes beyond teaching, correction, or even leadership. Because in Titus, Paul is no longer just shaping an individual. He's shaping culture. And that changes everything. The focus is not only on what one person believes, but on how an entire environment functions. Behavior, discipline, structure, consistency. And psychologically, this reveals a higher level of thinking, because influencing one person is different from stabilizing a system of people. Here, Paul is thinking in patterns. What happens when multiple personalities interact? When different levels of maturity collide? When inconsistency spreads quietly through behavior, not words? And instead of reacting to problems, he builds preventative clarity. Standards that are not just personal, but communal. And that shows something powerful. Long-term stability is not built by correcting issues after they appear. It's built by shaping behavior before problems emerge. But then, something subtle but important appears. The tone is firm, but not heavy, structured, but not rigid. Which means Paul understands something critical about human psychology. People don't just follow rules. They respond to environments. And if the environment is aligned, behavior follows naturally. But if the environment is unstable, even good intentions collapse. And that shifts the entire perspective, because now the focus is not only on what is right, but on what sustains what is right over time. And that raises a deeper question. Are you trying to fix outcomes, or are you building the kind of environment where the right outcomes become inevitable? Then everything slows down, but not in weakness, in depth. Because now we arrive at something many overlook, the psychological weight of endurance. In Hebrews, whether directly written by Paul or not, but deeply connected to his theological influence, you see a different kind of pressure being addressed. Not confusion, not immaturity, fatigue, spiritual exhaustion. And that's a completely different battlefield, because when someone is tired, logic is not enough. Correction is not enough. What they need is reinforcement at a deeper level. And that's exactly what this letter does. It rebuilds confidence, not through emotion, but through perspective. It connects present struggle to something larger, something eternal. And psychologically, this is critical, because people don't lose direction only when they are wrong. They lose direction when they are tired of doing what is right without seeing immediate results. And that's where most break, quietly, internally, without visible collapse, just a slow drift. And this letter speaks directly into that state. It doesn't just say continue, it explains why continuing matters. It reframes suffering. It redefines endurance. It shifts the focus from temporary discomfort to long-term alignment. And that changes everything. Because when perspective changes, energy returns. And when energy returns, consistency becomes possible again. And that reveals one of the deepest psychological truths in all these writings. People don't stop because they don't know what's right. They stop because they lose the reason to keep going. And that leads to a powerful question. Are you losing direction because you don't understand it, or because you've lost the perspective that once sustained you? Now everything begins to converge, not in new ideas, but in refinement. Because at this stage, Paul is no longer introducing concepts. He's reinforcing what must remain when everything else is tested. And this is where you see the psychological shift from learning to sustaining. In the final tone of his letters, especially echoed through 2 Timothy and reinforced in the broader Pauline voice, there is something unmistakable. Focus under pressure, not excitement, not expansion. Focus. Almost like everything unnecessary has been stripped away. And what remains is what truly matters. You see repetition, but not because of lack of ideas, because of emphasis. Because when pressure increases, the mind doesn't need more information. It needs clarity on what not to lose. And Paul understands that deeply. He knows that the real challenge is not starting well. It's finishing without drifting. And psychologically, that is one of the hardest things to do. Because over time, distraction grows, fatigue builds, external voices multiply, and without internal alignment, everything begins to blur. That's why the tone becomes sharper, more direct, less layered. It's no longer about exploration, it's about preservation. Guard what matters. Stay aligned. Don't dilute what you already know is true. And this reveals something powerful. Maturity is not measured by how much you know, but by how much you can hold on to when everything around you tries to pull you away. And that changes the entire perspective of growth, because growth is not just accumulation, it's retention under pressure. And that leads to a deeper question most people never stop to ask: are you still growing, or are you slowly losing what you once knew was essential? When you step back and look at all the letters in order, something becomes undeniable. This was never just about theology. It was a progression of the human mind under different conditions: instability, confusion, distortion, structure, identity, pressure, leadership, endurance, and finally, focus. Each letter is not just addressing a group, it's responding to a psychological state. And that's why the tone keeps changing, because Paul is not repeating himself. He's adapting. He's meeting people exactly where they are and moving them forward from that point. And when you see that, everything changes, because now these letters are not just historical, they are mirrors. At any moment, you can find yourself in one of those stages. Sometimes you need reassurance, sometimes correction, sometimes structure, sometimes endurance, and sometimes you just need to remember what not to lose. And that is the final layer most people miss. The power is not just in understanding the letters. It's in recognizing where you are within that progression. Because if you don't know your current state, you will apply the wrong response. You'll seek comfort when you need correction, structure when you need endurance, or movement when you actually need to stop and refocus. And that misalignment is where most people get stuck, not because they lack knowledge, but because they apply it in the wrong moment. And that brings everything to one final realization. Growth is not linear, it's responsive. And knowing what you need now is more important than knowing everything at once. Now, I want you to do something simple but impactful. Comment below where you're watching from and write Amen if this changed your perspective on the song's lyrics. Subscribe to the channel for more videos, and tell me in the comments what topic you'd like me to cover next.